welcome to Truth is Freedom. I'm Dennis Cummins, and I'm so glad that you've joined with us. We have a hot topic today, talking about domestic terrorism and DVEs, domestic violent extremists. And today we have our special guest, Herr. He is one of the co-founders for the Center for Self-Governance. And I'm so excited to have you on today, Mark. Welcome to our show. And I want to dive right into this because this little letter here to all Washingtonians is basically giving us the playbook, play-by-play of what they plan to do to those that have conservative biblical values. So, Mark, welcome. Go ahead.
Pastor, thanks for having me on your show. We talked a little bit last week about this problem called what we refer to as the political weaponization of labels and government. It's not new to human history. Jesus was labeled an insurrectionist by those who were concerned about control, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They manipulated the demos kratos, the democracy, turned them into a mob to release a criminal. And then they manipulated Pilate in terms of, hey, you got to take care of the mob. You just give us what we want, and everything will go back to calm and peace. So they ended up executing an innocent man. So labels and weaponizing government is not new to the 21st century.
Right.
So I don't think we should be shocked that there's this domestic violent extremism label, domestic terrorism label, white supremacy label, anti-government label, hate group label, reject federal authority label, that kind of thing. And so how do we understand it in modern terms? Because it's affecting us now. It's here now. Pastor, it's such a big and it's a complicated topic because what the Pharisees and the Sadducees did back then was manipulation of labels, manipulation of the masses, and manipulation of government in order to achieve their objective. And so we could say, is the same thing being accomplished in our lifetimes using the same strategy just in the 21st century? And our organization, after studying this for the last 13 years, feels that is the case, that there is an objective here that's tied to a conversion of the United States form of government. That's a topic in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But specifically, the Attorney General's letter. In his 31-page study called the 2022 Domestic Terrorism Study, he essentially, nutshell, says that Washington has a much bigger problem than domestic violent extremism according to federal definitions, and that problem is bearing its evil head in the state of Washington. So he says, we need to go beyond the scope of so-called acts of violence defined by the federal government into a completely new area of threats, coercion, intimidation, online disinformation, government infiltration, and then generally the rise of white supremacy and anti-government ideologies. As a solution to the proposed or supposed problem that he's describing, this increase in these areas beyond acts of violence defined by the federal government called domestic terrorism, the Attorney General cites FBI statistics as the basis for, hey, there is an increase. We see an upward trend, and this is a problem, you guys. So we need to do something about this. There is a problem with that. At the very beginning of his letter to all Washingtonians, especially the legislature, he cites these FBI statistics. On November 4th of last year, the House Judiciary Committee, made up of one side of the Republicans, put out a 1,050-page report. And in this report, they cite FBI whistleblowers who accuse or allege that the FBI was purposely inflating their domestic violent extremism cases.
Now, the government would never inflate statistics, right?
Right. And so
here they are again.
here they are again, and to justify this as a problem, they're potentially using inflated statistics from an entity where whistleblowers are making the allegation that those statistics are inflated. So that needs to be addressed before they implement this recommendations in this commission report. The second is that they rely on experts in extremism. So to break this up into two parts, we have to ask two questions. What is the definition of extremism? And what organizations are purporting to be extremism experts? One of the experts they used in their report is a lady named Cynthia Idris. And she's tied to a number of organizations that they list at the beginning of the report. But if you go into her bio and dig further, she's a member of an advisory committee for an organization called Southern Poverty Law Center's Extremism Council. Now, Southern Poverty Law Center is just one of the examples of these many organizations that they relied on for this report as extremist experts. Is responsible for labeling the Family Research Council anti-LGBTQ. And then subsequently under their website, hate, and then under hate, it's ideologies. Under ideologies, they list Family Research Council. In 2012, somebody who was researching their website found Family Research Council, organized himself with weapons to kill and Chick-fil-A sandwiches, entered their building, shot the security officer who struggled and subdued him, even though he was shot. And he, in the FBI's interview with him, he admitted to using the Southern Poverty Law Center's website to identify this organization to conduct this domestic violent extremist event. However, SPLC and the other organizations do not list that event as a domestic violent extremism event in this report, for example, but they use this expert for justifying the recommendations they're going to give. So far, our organization sees two problems: the potential that they're overinflating domestic violent extremism cases as justifications for this. Hey, we need to do this. This is a problem. Number two, using experts from organizations that are tied to mass shootings that are, I would say, domestic, occurred in the US, violent, actually shot someone, and extreme. That's extreme. He's going to rub Chick-fil-A in their faces on their dead bodies, he says. Using them in order to justify, and then saying that we have a different kind of problem in Washington, it boggles the mind. So the definition of extremism is problem number three. What is the definition of extreme? I think it's important, Pastor, that our communities come together in the state of Washington and have that discussion. What is the definition of extreme? Mm-hmm. In 2019, William von Spronson, who is pro-illegal immigration, he's pro-violating federal law on immigration. So I'm not saying he's right or wrong. What I'm saying, he's against the government's policy on immigration. So technically, we should be able to say he's anti-government, right? Mm-hmm. But this report does not list what he did in 2019. He gathered propane tanks, weapons, and went to a federal facility in Tacoma, Washington, shot at federal agents with the intention of blowing up the buildings and killing them in advance of his ideology, whatever that is. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying his ideology.
Right.
So the definition of extreme is unclear in this report and does not seem to include those types of extremist activities, or at least that our organization would say, not only is killing people because you're a white supremacist freaking out of your mind,
yeah,
but so is showing up to a Tacoma facility to kill federal agents and blow up the buildings for whatever your political beliefs are.
Right. You know, I go back to, I think a lot of Americans think of 9/11 and we think, oh, that's domestic terrorism. People come on to our land on the U.S. soil and they attack us with some kind of physical violence. But this really seems to be switching to, it's just no more, our freedom of speech is what is being attacked now. And as I read through this, he lists that this is going to impinge upon our First and Second Amendment. And
yes.
And of course, we have people say, well, we have the freedom of speech and we can, and that was tested. I don't know how many times here in the state of Washington on a freedom to gather as churches and a freedom to sing. And, you're only free if you exercise your freedom. And so many people just sat on their hands and said, well, we're just going to obey the government, and they gave up their rights. And what I'm troubled with is so many people that I've shared this with, some of them are like, well, that'll never happen. But yet it's just repeating what's already happened just the last couple of years, the dress rehearsal for the next big rollout. And of course, I saw the potential bill that is being submitted from the AG. I think you sent that to me through somebody. And this is real. They're going for this, right? To make it law.
This is not just the state of Washington, but nationwide and the other states as well, and at the federal level. So it's important to understand that the labeling always leads to weaponizing the government. So I'm going to give another Christian example to your listeners. So in the 1600s, the Puritans had fled the religious persecution of King James I in England in the early 1600s. They settled in Massachusetts and created the Massachusetts Bay Colony under William Bradford. And so the Mayflower Compact, right? The Pilgrims, Kirk Cameron, all that stuff, right? Well, the Puritans started to see an influx of immigrants from different diverse backgrounds in relationship to Quakers and Catholics and Baptists, et cetera. And I'm going to particularly focus on the Quakers. So the Quakers and their doctrines and religions didn't mesh up. And so the Puritans had control of the system, began to label them heretics and witches. So labels. Yeah. Then within their legislative process began to create an atmosphere to weaponize the government. So they started taking their property, they would beat them in public. And in 1658, they actually passed a law to execute them. So much so that King Charles I had to step in and say, okay, you need to stop, except you can do that to Catholics. Okay.
Wow.
All right. So the labels always lead to the weaponized government. And whether it's true for the Lord Jesus Christ, it's true for the Puritans versus the Quakers, and it's true for us in the 21st century. And so it does infringe upon First Amendment, many of your civil rights, this process. And the key is to understand how they are articulating this and why you need to be concerned and become involved in being part of the conversation. And I think that's the critical piece, is the conversation.
Oh, go ahead.
I got to repeat these problems in the paper. The one is they're overinflated FBI statistics. That is being sought out at the federal level. It needs to be questioned here. Why are you using potentially overinflated statistics? Number two, why are you using experts from organizations that have been involved in violence and extremism themselves? And then number three is these definitions. What is an extreme? What is extreme? What is an extremist? Is it legal, or is it just my attorney general opinion? What is extreme to Dennis may not be extreme to Ben Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And right now he's the attorney general. So if his definition is controlling his report, then he's advancing a definition that may not agree with yours. So that's a reason why the communities, as diverse as they are, need to be a part of this conversation. We need to come to a common definition of extreme, not a lopsided definition. The fourth problem is the word stakeholder. In this paper, they reached out to what they call diverse stakeholders. How come you weren't called to be a part of that conversation?
Right.
Or how come Center for Self-Governance, which operates in many states, but we do a lot of our operations to teach people about government in the state of Washington. How come we weren't approached? Why wasn't other churches or other business organizations or et cetera? They specifically targeted one community called the BIPOC community, listed in their paper. And they reached out to the community to identify their concerns, which are legitimate because they have been disproportionately targeted by law enforcement across the United States. The statistics on that are clear across the board. But their language, they say they are concerned about being the loss of due process. And that is the biggest concern I have with this paper, Dennis, the loss of liberties. And one of those is called due process. If you are labeled a heretic and a witch in Massachusetts in the 1600s, or you're Jesus in whatever AD that was, there was no due process. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the tenets of our nations, not just the creation in 1700s, but in the 21st century, is this debate and this conversation about, is due process just as good for Dennis as it is for me? And if it's good for me, it should be just as good for Dennis.
Mm-hmm.
Or BIPOC community or whoever. But that conversation is being disproportionately applied in this paper, and that is a huge concern for our organization. And the number one reason we'd encourage your audience to be a part of the conversation. Due process should apply to all Washingtonians. And if you're going to use the phrase diverse stakeholders, then make sure diverse stakeholders include all Washingtonians. And number three, if you're going to use the word extreme, make sure that we all have a common agreement of what that means.
Right. Absolutely.
Here's the downside, Dennis, is that right now, so far, not a single police officer has been decertified, but they have a process in place to decertify law enforcement officers if they are accused or found to be a part of an extremist organization. And that raises a red flag for me and our organization. Wait a second. There's no legal definition for extreme. There's no legal definition for stakeholder, but you can decertify a law enforcement officer because they're a member of an extremist organization. Who created that list?
Yeah, exactly.
Dennis,
well,
do you know where that list is? Have you seen that list?
Exactly. This is fascism at its strongest that I think we've ever seen hitting America, especially the state of Washington. So I tell you what, we're going to come back in our next episode, and I want to talk about how we're weaponizing the health department to handle this, and also basically using that to remove due process. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about that.